Headlines bring the people of the United Nations the most sensational news of the war, the surrender of Italy.
By the late summer of 1943, Allied forces had won major victories at Stalingrad, Tunis, and Kursk. The invasion of Sicily in August prompted secret negotiations by Italy to quit the war. Both sides reacted swiftly. Germany sent occupation troops and installed an Italian puppet government. The Allies landed on the mainland in September. The Germans left much of southern Italy in Allied hands, retreating to a strong series of defensive positions they called the Winter Line, in which they hoped to hold out well into 1944. One of the key German positions overlooking Highway 6, the main artery from Naples to Rome, was Monte la Defensa. Its eastern face was a steep cliff towering over the Allied lines. The Germans were convinced no Allied attack could come from that direction, and spared no men to defend the approach. A joint American-Canadian unit called the 1st Special Service Force climbed the cliff on the morning of 3 December 1943 and overwhelmed the German defenders. The fighting on La Defensa inspired a Hollywood movie and countless books and documentaries. The legend of the 1st Special Service Force continues to be cultivated in popular culture to this day. What did not become part of the legend were the logistical, administrative, and political obstacles the unit continually faced. Most histories concentrate on their tactical successes and ignore just how complex the relationship between the Canadian and American components of the force actually was. This video will discuss some of these lesser-known aspects of the complicated history of the 1st Special Service Force. As part of the Combined Operations Program designed to tie down German forces in Western Europe with commando raids all along the Atlantic coast, the Allies drafted plans for an ambitious raid on Norway's hydroelectric plants. To carry out the mission, American and Canadian volunteers were assembled in a unique binational unit created in the summer of 1942 called the 1st Special Service Force. Their mission to Norway was scrubbed shortly after the unit began training. Among those responsible for the cancellation was the Royal Air Force, which wanted its planes bombing Germany instead of ferrying commandos and supplies, and the exiled Norwegian government, who wanted to spare their people at home crippling infrastructure losses. The relationship between US and Canadian authorities was put to its first test when the Canadians were still on the trains to their new base in Montana. Defying a joint censorship agreement, the Americans put out a press release on 5 August 1942 announcing the unit's name, location, and details of their training to the world. They neglected to tell Canadian officials, who had presumed the project was top secret. A number of newspapers in Canada carried the story on page 1. With Norway cancelled, the force was left without a mission, but Canadian authorities feared that if they withdrew from the project, it would generate negative publicity and warn the Germans that no attack on Norway was being considered. The Canadians trained with the force during the winter of 1942-43, while Allied planners tried to figure out how to use them. After the fierce fighting on Japanese-held Attu in May 1943, the force was included in the assault on Kiska in August. After landing, the Allies discovered the Japanese had evacuated the island in secret not long before, and in the wake of this intelligence failure, the force was quickly returned to the United States. By now, the force was highly trained in mountain and winter warfare, airborne operations, advanced demolitions, and amphibious landings. Without having fired a single shot in anger during their first year of existence, their most significant contribution to the war effort may have been a donation of cash to the United States Navy. The long struggle to find a mission worthy of the force's talents ended on 17 November 1943, when the unit arrived in Italy. Just 2 weeks later, the exorbitant price paid in training the force finally paid off. They scaled the cliffs of La Defensa under a heavy bombardment, and unlike the movie In Darkness, they routed the German defenders and captured the mountaintop. After 6 days of counterattacks, the force was still there, having lost 511 men, or a quarter of its strength. It was the first act in a series of successful operations clearing mountains north of the Mignano Gap, overlooking Highway 6. Monte Sammucro fell at Christmas, and Monte Maggio in January. The Allies advanced, but only a little further, stopped again underneath the commanding heights of Monte Cassino. It would take 6 more months of hard fighting before Allied troops could finally get past Cassino and into the Liri Valley. In the meantime, the Allies tried to flank the Germans with an amphibious landing at Anzio, but the advance inland bogged down quickly. The 1st Special Service Force arrived in the beachhead on the 1st of February and took over the eastern flank of the stagnated front, Remaining in static positions until late May, they earned a reputation for toughness with their aggressive patrolling and raids across the lines. When the front began moving again, they led the drive to Rome, which fell on 4 June. The force then went into 7 weeks of training for the amphibious landings in southern France in August 1944. Relatively small battles followed there, while entire German armies in Normandy and Russia were being destroyed. The combat history of the 1st Special Service Force came to an end not with a dramatic flourish, but by fizzling out on the Riviera. Early histories of the force, written by American historians, created a mythology given new power by motion pictures,
Black Devils.
featuring a heavily fictionalized and romanticized view of the unit.
Anybody faint?
The U.S. Army's volume on military relations between the United States and Canada, called the 1st Special Service Force a successful experiment, but tepidly noted the inordinate amount of high-level consideration that went into creating it. The Canadian Army's official historian felt that the administrative, political, logistical, and diplomatic difficulties argued against ever creating another similar combined force without careful thought. The first low-level detailed history of the force was written by its wartime intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert D. Burns. Like many unit histories written soon after the war, it was a sympathetic and largely unblemished portrayal. This kind of history was common immediately after the war. Former officers, for the most part, were writing about comrades living and dead, for whom sensitivity was more important than frank questions about their military abilities. The histories were usually simple timelines with a little analysis, written for fellow veterans with a little explanation of how things were done or why. It would be difficult to be hard on the men who attended your wedding or died at your side. Authors in this period were also sensitive to creating international tensions between allies as the Cold War loomed. Burns' book therefore ignores most of the administrative issues the Canadians in the force experienced. While even the most recent books concentrate on the fighting for La Defensa, a major legacy of the force's history, the battle brought about other events which highlighted just how uneasy the relationship between the two national contingents really was, something many of the force histories gloss over. One of the biggest issues throughout the history of the force was the issue of pay. While the Canadian and US dollars were more or less at par, Canadians were paid wages significantly less than Americans at the same rank levels. Canadians volunteered believing this would not be the case, and the substantial disparity was a continual sore point. A Canadian private received $62.50 a month, while American privates got $100, and the disparities worsened at each higher rank level. A Canadian staff sergeant was paid less than an American private. The Canadians were also refused the hazardous training supplement, or jump pay, that their American counterparts received for qualifying as paratroops. Canadian officers repeated in good faith the promises of authorities to rectify the situation, and were then caught in the middle when those promises were broken. Canadian forcemen required to assign part of their pay to their families sometimes increased those allotments based on the promised pay rates, leaving them cash poor on payday. The Canadian Army reassessed the force as more than just a parachute unit and scrapped its plans for a Canadian Parachute Corps of 2 battalions. On 5 May 1943, the 2nd Canadian Parachute Battalion, the administrative entity to which the Canadian contingent of the force belonged, became the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion on paper. Canadians and Americans alike adopted U.S. Army uniforms with a distinctive red arrowhead shoulder sleeve insignia. Wherever the force traveled, they were armed, clothed, and equipped exclusively by the U.S. Army. A cumbersome promotion policy requiring the approval of former units in Canada was addressed by a formal change in legal status that permitted the Americans to permanently promote and discipline Canadians serving with the force. Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King felt that the level of integration, where Canadians and Americans could operate together in the field without regard to nationality, was a truly remarkable development in international affairs. So it was, but to many Canadians, integration meant losing their Canadian identities. Early in the force's history, the commanding officer, Colonel Robert Frederick, dramatically changed the focus of the unit, slashing by over half the training required for parachute qualification. The force wouldn't train to be a paratroop unit because it wasn't expected to fight like one. Even the truncated jump training, requiring just 2 jumps in broad daylight, weeded out many recruits. By the end of August 1942, 471 of the 567 Canadians in Montana had completed jump training. 3 months later, 335 Canadians had been returned to Canada for various reasons, some from fear of heights, others from injury or disciplinary issues, leaving the contingent short 3 officers and 134 other ranks. Part of the force's legend is that the Canadians were all hand-selected, but in reality, recruiting was done by calls for volunteers. Some unit COs in Canada were leery of losing their best soldiers and therefore discarded calls for volunteers instead of circulating them to the men. Some of the best parachutists likewise never made it to the airborne units, as they were retained as instructors at jump schools instead of being released for combat duty. Before long, volunteers for Canadian jump training dried up. Men eager to get into action saw it as a dead end. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was earmarked as a reserve unit in Canada in the event of a Japanese invasion, and the force in Montana had no better prospects of action. Soldiers eager to see action decided the safe bet was to stay with their units in Canada. Popular culture also makes it sound like Frederick was beating the bushes for lumberjacks and fur trappers, but the personnel selection guidelines called only for volunteers who had completed advanced army training, met the physical requirements of paratroopers, were suitable for service in winter conditions, were considered good NCO material, and as a bonus had knowledge of internal combustion engines, since the original mission of the force called for it to be equipped with a purpose-built snow vehicle called the Weasel. The largest source of Canadians was the regiments of the Canadian Army that had not mobilized battalions for overseas service. The Midland Regiment's commanding officer even attempted to send his entire unit. All but a handful of Midlands volunteered, but the rigorous selection process meant only a small number of them made it into the force. The 1st Special Service Force was composed of 3 regiments of 2 battalions, though these units were smaller than the name suggested. As originally conceived, the 6 fighting battalions were to be made up of 50% Canadians and 50% Americans. There was also a service battalion manned entirely by Americans with headquarters, maintenance, and service companies to provide logistical and medical support, with an intelligence section, signalmen, military police, parachute riggers, band, cook, supply troops, etc. Each of the 6 battalions had 3 companies with 3 platoons. The platoons were divided into 2 sections of 12 men, fielding a mixture of rifles, submachine guns, and light machine guns, augmented by bazookas and 60mm mortars. Each man received a V-42 fighting knife, and .45 caliber handguns were plentiful. The force arrived in Italy with about 2,200 men, including 600 Canadians. In their first battle at La Defensa, over 500 men were killed and wounded, including 15% of the Canadian contingent. The Canadian War Diary noted that, at this rate, the Canadian element which is not being reinforced will not survive many like missions. The losses continued into 1944 as the force operated in the mountains above the Mignano Gap. Throughout January 1944, the force was losing on average 100 men a day to wounds, frostbite, and exposure to the bitter, wintry mountaintop conditions. By late January, just 400 forcemen were left alive and uninjured. The war diarist of the Canadian contingent once again expressed the fears of all of them when he wrote that if casualties keep at this rate, there won't be much left of the force. The government's policy on reinforcements was a legacy of the force's original mission to Norway. Canadian casualties would not be replaced. Canadian military headquarters in London was shocked by the losses, and the Chief of Staff, General Ken Stewart, recommended surviving forcemen return to the Canadian Army. The force's senior Canadian, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Gilday, made the same recommendation. Ottawa refused, fearing it would be a national embarrassment. Americans were also questioning the force's value in the wake of the mountain fighting. The deputy commander of the Mediterranean Theater, General Devers, wanted it disbanded as a waste of resources. Colonel Frederick thought that his force was poorly organized for the new combat role it had been forced into, a matter made worse by the crippling lack of Canadian and American reinforcements. The unit was never intended for conventional head-on attacks into prepared German defenses, and while it had a high proportion of automatic weapons, it had lacked heavy fire support and adequate medical communications and supply units. Even if Ottawa had been willing to send Canadian replacements, they would have been unfamiliar with American weapons and equipment. Removing the Canadians altogether would be extremely disruptive, since many of the force's key positions, including regimental and battalion commanders, were filled by Canadians. It was a no-win situation. Frederick also worried about the political fallout if Canadians felt their men were being sacrificed unnecessarily by American authorities. For all those reasons and more, in early 1944, Frederick joined the chorus of those suggesting that the force should be disbanded, as he put it, while still in its prime. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, the commander of the U.S. Fifth Army, had no intention of splitting up the force, and responded to Frederick's concerns about the table of organization and equipment not being consistent with the unit's actual combat role. The force was spared from another mountaintop assault at Mount Cairo, and instead moved to the Anzio beachhead near the Pontine Marshes, and given the line of the Mussolini Canal to patrol. At the end of February, the U.S. contingent numbered 42 officers and 898 men, including the support elements, and the Canadians 31 officers and 325 men. They covered off close to 25% of the entire front line in the bridgehead, with fewer than 1,500 troops on a frontage normally held by an entire division. The force was beefed up with 4 half-track mounted 75mm guns, and in March the 456th Parachute Artillery Battalion was attached, with 12 75mm pack howitzers and 4 37mm anti-tank guns. The force thrived at Anzio, mounting patrols and raids behind enemy lines, the role they had originally trained for. The force's reputation for toughness was enhanced by the efforts of their intelligence staff, who came up with the story of a German officer complaining to his diary about the Black Devils who owned the night at Anzio. It was fiction, but boosted the morale of the forcemen and became another major element of the post-war mythology. The force obtained stickers proclaiming the worst is yet to come in German, and left them on the bodies of enemy soldiers. The force had come into its element. When the 4th Ranger Battalion was disbanded, 20 officers and 500 men went to the force, a move that was not universally popular. Some Rangers chafed at leaving their own elite organization, and felt the force was a poorly organized mess, while some forcemen scoffed at the newcomers as Rangers in name only, given their relative lack of experience. This influx of Americans left the Canadians as a decided minority, and administrative issues still lingered. The unequal pay had not been addressed, and the men were ineligible for awards available to their peers throughout the rest of the Canadian Army. Some men feared that their chances for promotion would be stunted in a largely American outfit, while the Canadian officers felt frustration at being left out of the administration and planning of operations. In April 1944, the Canadian Army finally relinquished and supplied much-needed reinforcements. Given its new combat requirements, the prerequisite for replacements of parachute training was eliminated, and the Canadian Army promised to reinforce the Canadian contingent with infantrymen already sent to the theatre to serve with the 1st Canadian Corps. Volunteers produced 15 officers and 240 other ranks, none of whom had been trained on the American weapons the force was using. They were given a 2-week course, and on 27 April the force was once again over 2,000 men strong. Canadian forcemen in Italy, who were paid in local currency, received a more favorable exchange rate than the other Canadians in theatre, netting them on average about $22 extra every month. The error went undiscovered until after the unit left Anzio, and the Canadian Contingent War Diary bitterly noted, "There is always someone digging morale busters out of the hat." In a surprising show of bureaucratic mercy, the Army did not try to recover the 8 months' worth of overpayments. The Canadian reinforcements also received Canadian parachute pay, despite not having qualified as paratroops. The Canadian rate was $2 a day for officers and 75 cents for other ranks. At that rate, enlisted men made less than half the U.S. jump pay of $50 a month. A vivid demonstration that the U.S. and Canadian armies had their own unique cultures was demonstrated in April 1944. The nominal role of the force includes a number of black-skinned Canadians, such as Lloyd Arthur States of New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, and Lieutenant P.M. Critchlow from Barbados. It's not clear when they joined the force, but when 2 black Canadians and 1 Indo-Canadian arrived in the April reinforcements, they were rejected and sent back to the Canadian Army, victims of the U.S. Army's policy of racial segregation. It was an unhappy episode, ignored in Burns' history of the force, which mentions the Canadian reinforcements only in passing. There were other unhappy episodes, equally absent from many books, such as the fates of the 3 men appointed to command the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion during its existence. Major John McQueen was second in command of the 1st Battalion Calgary Highlanders in the UK when he was selected to command the Canadian contingent of the force and act as its second in command. McQueen was with the force for about a month before fracturing an ankle in August 1942. Approximately 80 Canadians were injured by the accelerated parachute training, and the more seriously injured were immediately struck from their roles and returned to Canada. The injury was no fault of McQueen's. As senior officer, he volunteered to be the first man in the Canadian contingent to jump, and faulty instruction early in the accelerated jump training caused lower leg injuries to about 25% of the trainees. The force's photo detachment determined their method of landing with feet apart was the culprit. Injuries went down after the landing method was changed to feet together, but it was too late for dozens of prospective forcemen, McQueen among them. He went to Washington on staff duties related to the force, and eventually made his way to the UK. One can only speculate how the contingent would have fared under McQueen. In January 1944, he took command of the 1st Battalion Lincoln and Welland Regiment and landed in Normandy in July 1944. McQueen was relieved just 3 weeks later. McQueen was apparently harshly affected by the death of his soldiers in their first action, to the point he refused to leave his slit trench. He was transferred to staff duties with 21st Army Group Headquarters, took over the Canadian Military Staff Office in Paris, and served in Berlin after VE Day. He left the military as a full colonel and died in 1990, aged 77. McQueen was replaced by Major Don Williamson of the Dufferin and Haldimand Rifles, another regiment that had not mobilized an overseas battalion. McQueen's first choice of successor had been Lieutenant Colonel Robert Keane, a regular Army officer from the Royal Canadian Regiment, but Keane was also injured in jump training and left the force. McQueen had been the force's executive officer, or 2IC in Canadian jargon, but that slot was filled by an American following his departure, and Force HQ became exclusively American. Williamson completed his jump training despite a fear of heights, and took command of the 2nd Regiment with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The Canadian element had a separate headquarters to handle distinctly national administrative matters. This left Williamson dozens of details to oversee, and constant compromises with the U.S. contingent. Logistical concerns forced the abandonment of Canadian uniforms, and the Americans' unique rank structure likewise ruled out Canadian insignia. During the year-long wait for combat, Williamson watched a number of Canadians request return to their old units, some of them impatient for action, others spiteful over the unequal pay situation. Before the force headed to Italy, Williamson's monthly report on the Canadian contingent expressed his disappointment that despite his best efforts, they were going into battle 141 short of full strength due to the logistical challenges in procuring and training additional Canadian volunteers. Williamson arrived in Italy as a full colonel, but only served there for a few weeks. Canadian Army historian Gerald Nicholson noted in a report in 1946 that Williamson left the force for medical reasons. This assertion is also made in passing in Lieutenant Colonel Burns' 1947 history. Edelman and Walton's book in 1966 mention Williamson's departure in passing without giving a reason, and Daniel Dancock's book on the Italian campaign uses Burns as a source and repeats the medical rationale. A book by John Nadler in 2005 contained a different telling of what happened to Williamson, alleging that a fearful Williamson was badly shaken by the violence and morbidly concerned with sniper fire during the assault on La Defensa, and was out of commission during the battle. Command devolved to his senior battalion commander, Tom McWilliam, who was killed in the fighting. Nadler ignores Williamson's year-long struggle to help build the force, and he's dismissed as an officer who was probably better as an organizer and administrator than a combat commander. A year after Nadler's book came out, Ken Joyce, working from primary documents, laid out a much different and nuanced story in his own book. An even more detailed monograph by Joyce on Williamson's experience with the force is available online, linked to in the video description. The tale, as Joyce tells it, starts out happily enough. Colonel Frederick had been very impressed with Williamson's work as senior Canadian. The two contingents were never segregated, and the Canadians and Americans were distributed throughout the fighting battalions. Those that survived the rigorous training worked well together, thanks to the efforts of the force's regimental and battalion commanders. Joyce points out that Frederick was often absent from the day-to-day running of the force, spending his time in Washington or elsewhere on high-level talks about how and where to employ the force. Frederick's opinion of Williamson was enhanced when Williamson's 2nd Regiment spearheaded the assault on La Defensa. In fact, Frederick's initial instinct in the wake of the battle was to recommend Williamson for the Legion of Merit, to recognize his combat leadership, a detail Nadler leaves out. The recommendation was made on 18 December, more than 2 weeks after the initial assault, and 10 days after fighting stopped. During this time, Williamson was discharging his stressful duties as senior Canadian, with 2 trips to the Canadian base in Naples. The Americans were ready to hand out medals for La Defensa to deserving soldiers, but Canadian officials wouldn't consent to the authorization of any Canadian awards. Williamson thought it would be an embarrassment if American soldiers were presented awards, but Canadians weren't, and so pressed the issue, as well as the need for replacements for the men lost on La Defensa. With no replacements, Williamson had to commission 8 NCOs just to fill the officer vacancies. Williamson returned to the force empty-handed in the face of apparent Canadian indifference to their pay, award, and replacement issues. Canadian forces had suffered heavily in the Moral River and at Ortona, and rather than reward the Canadians of the force, they were in fact contemplating removing them from the force. Williamson's 2nd Regiment, which had suffered the heaviest losses, was in a supporting role for the force's next major attack on Hill 720 at Christmas. In the meantime, his Legion of Merit recommendation was withdrawn. The force's adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Wickham, had heard something troubling about Williamson, serious enough to start collecting evidence against him. On New Year's Day, with the force huddled on exposed mountainsides in cold and rain, Williamson was called to the force's command post and told that a number of forcemen had been interviewed by Wickham and Frederick and declared they had no confidence in his leadership. Nador's history may have been drawn largely from these affidavits, as well as recollections of surviving members of the Force Association. Joyce also discusses the allegations of the affidavits in detail. In broad terms, they allege that Williamson had been overly fearful of German fire. At one point, Williamson reportedly returned fire with his pistol. Joyce suggests it may have been out of frustration. One of the affidavits claimed he was actually blind firing into friendly troops in a panic. Joyce used the force message logs and photographic evidence to examine the other main allegations, that Williamson absented himself from his duties, leaving control of his regiment to his subordinates. Frederick suggested that Williamson be fired as senior Canadian. Williamson contested the adverse report the day he learned of it, explaining that he returned to Frederick's command post during the assault due to a lack of radio communication, and that he returned to his regiment's forward CP and stayed there throughout the battle. His alleged obsession with enemy fire was due to the presence of an armed German on high ground atop La Defensa, either firing down or marking targets for German mortars and rockets with tracer fire. The next day, Williamson reported to a Canadian hospital for an interview. He explained the stress of commanding a national contingent in such a unique unit, where two very different military cultures were blended, and insisted the affidavits contained many falsehoods. The interview had been conducted by a psychiatric advisor who concluded Williamson was sane, though obviously affected by his combat experience. Whatever conclusions were drawn was done from the meager evidence at hand. Williamson requested an inquiry, but none followed. The Canadian Army sent Williamson back to Canada based almost entirely on the weight of what was contained in the affidavits and his brief interview. His men were told that Williamson was suffering from ulcers, a lie that became part of the historical record. The matter didn't sit well with the Canadians. Lieutenant Colonel Tom Gilday assumed the role of acting senior Canadian, and on 13 January returned from the front to discover what had happened to Williamson. He immediately began collecting affidavits to defend him. As well, the other two regimental commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Marshall and Lieutenant Colonel Walker, showed full support for Williamson. None of it mattered, and on 24 January, the Canadian War Diarist bluntly stated that it was regrettable Williamson was leaving under conditions which he did not deserve. Canadian Army policy was to return commanders to Canada after unsuccessful command tours, with no chance for another overseas assignment. Despite Williamson's excellent job in training and integrating Canadians into the force, he was not permitted to stay in the UK in a training role. On 18 February, Williamson was returned to Canada. Williamson passed away in August 1966, largely forgotten. Ken Joyce suggests that his obscurity was deliberate. Over the years, whenever members of the Force Association were asked for interviews by historians, Force veterans asked that Williamson's dismissal be explained by the phony medical story published by Nicholson, Burns, and Dancox, among others. On 12 January 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Akehurst was officially named Senior Canadian, taking over from Tom Gilday. For his service with the force, Frederick was promoted out after Anzio to become a Major General in charge of the airborne forces in southern France. His command, which included the force, was severely underemployed on the Riviera, and in September 1944 he once again suggested that the force be disbanded. The Canadian Army was also concerned about the future of the 1st Special Service Force, which was becoming increasingly difficult to administer, and from which the Canadian Army received no practical value. General Stewart also suggested, again, the disbandment of the force. In the last weeks of the force's existence, the Canadian contingent was still reporting that the administration of pay continued to be a failure, and that joint administration simply hadn't worked. Canadian officers were disappointed that they were ineligible to attend staff schools or other Canadian Army training, and not one deserving man in the force had received an award from their own military. By late 1944, there were many elite units in Europe but casualties among the regular infantry divisions had been higher than predicted. The British had to disband units to keep others up to strength, and Canada had to augment its force of volunteers with conscripts and remusters. The Americans were in a similar manpower crunch. In June 1944, an American colonel named Edwin Ted Walker replaced Frederick as commander of the 1st Special Service Force. Walker is perhaps best remembered today for his right-wing politics after the war, and a failed attempt on his life in 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. In October 1944, the war diary of the Canadian contingent frankly noted that the senior Canadian, Jack Akehurst, had not gotten along with Walker, and noted the growing dissatisfaction among the Canadians. Instead of belonging to a unique binational unit, the Canadians instead felt they had been abandoned and neglected by their own country. The force's support echelon was entirely American, and the combat elements were by now 2/3 American. Akehurst had enough and requested a transfer out. Walker approved it, but by that point it was academic, as the force's history was coming to a close. Friction at the senior levels of the force may have been worse than the standard post-war accounts suggest. When Williamson left the force, Walker had sent a letter of sympathy to him, calling the force a one-man unappreciative show. The one-man show reference was undoubtedly to Frederick, who ended the war as the second youngest divisional commander in the U.S. Army. James Gavin was 8 days younger. Frederick's role in the organization and combat leadership of the force is often emphasized in histories, for instance the fact he was wounded 8 times in combat, yet it was the regimental commanders, like Williamson, who planned operations and carried them out. After disbandment in December, the Canadians without parachute training went to Italy to join the infantry reinforcement stream. Many were bitter that they had volunteered for parachute training but were never given the opportunity, and in the words of Lieutenant Colonel Akehurst, felt they were being ditched. Akehurst accompanied the jump-qualified Canadians to the United Kingdom, then joined his former unit, the Algonquin Regiment, commanding it to the end of the war. One of the many administrative issues that Williamson had fought to improve was the ineligibility of Canadian personnel to receive decorations from their own countrymen. The Canadians were also ineligible for U.S. Army decorations until a change in policy in April 1944. Awards presented by the Americans were worn last in the Canadian order of precedence, since foreign awards for valor were rated below the service medals that everyone else in the Canadian Army got just for showing up overseas. Americans who served on Kiska received the Asia-Pacific Campaign Medal, but Canadians were denied the Commonwealth's Pacific Star, since Canada defined the Pacific Theater of Operations differently than the Americans. Some Canadian veterans applied for the star and received it in error. Others apparently obtained their own and wore them, in Ken Joyce's words, out of spite. The Americans were also entitled to the Combat Infantry Badge, a tangible display of experience in frontline combat, but the Canadians were denied these too, something that wasn't rectified until 2005, when all Canadian members of the force who met the requirements were belatedly granted permission to wear it. In November 1944, permission was finally granted to authorize British medals for force members retroactively, after the force had fired its last shots in anger. The inability for the Canadians to recognize the bravery of their peers was just one more source of frustration throughout the life of the force. The order to disband the force is often lamented by post-war observers unable to understand why such a highly trained light infantry unit was dismantled. As we have seen, officials in both the US and Canada, as well as the senior officers in the force itself, had continually called for the disbandment of the force throughout its history. Had the force remained intact into 1945, there were probably few ways they might have made a meaningful contribution to the war effort. They were probably not employable as paratroops given their state of parachute training. Their specialization in amphibious landings would probably not have been needed. The British crossed the Rhine on a massive scale, while the Americans managed to get across the river without a major landing operation. The fighting at Livrignano and Highway 65 comes to mind, where the German hand grenade division effectively barred the way to Bologna. Given the tough going the US 91st Infantry Division faced trying to break through the German 65th Infantry Division in rough, hilly terrain, this might have proven worthy of the force's talents. However, by early 1945, Canadian administrative units were leaving Italy en masse for Northwest Europe, leaving 417 Squadron of the RCAF as the only Canadian combatants in the Italian theatre. They confessed to feeling marooned, and things would have been no better for the surviving Canadian forcemen. Perhaps the force could have raced to Bologna and the Po River in the same way they secured the Tiber bridges in Rome. but there was no value in that for Canadian authorities, who had taken a large political hit by finally sending draftees to Europe in November 1944. Instead, the force was deemed to have outlived its usefulness, and they were quietly dissolved after the anticlimax of the Champagne campaign in the vineyards of the Riviera. The Americans largely, and ironically, given what their actual mission was supposed to be in 1942, went to Norway, adopting the spearhead patch for the new 474th Infantry Regiment, created from the American contingent of Forcemen in January 1945. The Canadians reinforced other units, in particular the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which jumped over the Rhine and became the first Canadian unit to make contact with the Red Army. The Burns history claims that never a breach formed between the US and Canadian in the 2.5 years of cooperative work together. It was a nice sentiment, and perhaps complaints about pay and medals distract from the force's real achievements, and on a personal level, the men integrated well and performed tough missions well. If there was friction along national lines, it doesn't seem to have impeded their abilities. Had the force been employed for its original mission in Norway, then disbanded, it might be easier to assess the success of the organization. Its accomplishments in the mountains do it much credit, since they were employed in tasks for which they were not properly equipped or supported, and their service at Anzio, with more appropriate missions, enhanced a hard-won reputation. Robert Frederick had suggested the force be disbanded in its prime after La Defensa. Little is remembered today of the force's involvement in the invasion of southern France. The difficulties in molding such a unit in the face of so many adversities should add to the unit's luster rather than detract from it. And for that reason, those elements of the story also deserve to be remembered. Canadian Army records indicate that 156 soldiers of the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion were killed in action or died of wounds. Their remains are buried in Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries in Italy and southern France.
Brigadier General Koenig, Commander UK Base, United States Army, presents U.S. awards to Canadians. The recipients are members of the Special Service Force composed of American and Canadian Army personnel who fought together in some tough spots in the drive into Germany. Silver Stars go to Sergeant G.A. Rainville of Bonneville, Ontario, to Staff Sergeant J.K. Knight of Wolford, Alberta, to another Westerner, Sergeant D.F. Peterson of Cardston, Alberta, and to the representative of Scanterbury, Manitoba, Sergeant Prince. Private R.J. Scully of Windsor, Ontario receives his star. The Bronze Star goes to Sergeant W.J. McGee of Toronto and to Sergeant Barnett of Montreal for deeds of outstanding bravery.